sky over Seoul didn't weep that night. It bled neon. Eric Lawrence stood at the apex of his empire, the floor-to-ceiling glass of his penthouse reflecting a man who owned the horizon. He was the undisputed king of the Lawrence syndicate, draped in a charcoal silk suit that cost more than a common man's life, sipping a vintage whiskey that burned with the heat of 1,000 conquered enemies. Beside him stood his brother-in-arms, Min-jun, the shadow to his light for 20 years. They had climbed out of the gutters of Incheon together, building a throne upon a mountain of broken bones and ironclad loyalty. Or so Eric believed. The betrayal didn't come with a roar. It came with the soft, metallic click of a safety being disengaged. "The board wants a diplomat, Eric," Min-jun whispered, his voice devoid of the warmth they had shared since childhood. "But the streets, they want a god, and you've become too human." Before Eric could turn, the world tilted into a blur of silver and agony. The blade didn't seek his heart. That would have been too merciful. It sought his face, his pride, his identity. The steel carved a jagged canyon from his jaw to his collarbone, a searing line of fire that signaled the end of his reign. As Eric collapsed, his blood staining the white marble like an inkblot of failure, the red lunar coup erupted outside. Explosions rocked the city skyline, signaling the systematic execution of every captain loyal to the Lawrence name. Min-jun looked down at him, his face a mask of cold ambition. "A king is nothing without his crown, brother. Let's see how long you last as a dog." Eric didn't die. Driven by a primal, blackened rage, he dragged his broken body through the service tunnels of his own building, a shadow among the pipes and rats. He reached the Incheon docks as a ghost, his suit tattered and soaked in the brine of the Yellow Sea. He didn't board a private jet or a luxury liner. He crawled into the rusted, oil-slicked bowels of a Panamanian cargo ship bound for Tokyo. For 3 days, he lay in the dark, pressed against vibrating steel, his wound festering in the salt air. He watched the light of Korea fade into a pinprick through a porthole, his empire reduced to a memory of screams and gunsmoke. When he finally stumbled onto the rain-slicked concrete of Tokyo, he was no longer Eric Lawrence. He was a nameless, scawed creature of the night. He traded his ruined silk for the grease-stained rags of a shipyard scavenger and disappeared into the labyrinth of the city, carrying nothing but a cold lantern and a heart that had finally, irrevocably, turned to stone. Tokyo was a city of light that thrived on a foundation of shadow, and Eric Lawrence had become its most silent inhabitant. For 6 months, he occupied a sliver of damp concrete under the bridge, a human gargoyle watching the world move with a frantic, unseeing energy. He learned the rhythm of the city's cruelty, the way a salaryman's pace quickened as he approached Eric's cardboard mat, the way high-heeled tourists pulled their designer bags closer, as if poverty were a contagious disease. To them, he was part of the urban debris, a discarded object that occasionally smelled of rain and old misery. He watched a group of teenagers laugh while filming a TikTok, their bright screens illuminating the disgust on their faces as they used him as a background prop for a gritty aesthetic. He watched a policeman's heavy boot kick his collection of plastic bottles into the river just because it was Tuesday. Eric didn't fight back. He didn't even speak. He was a predator in a state of deep hibernation, observing the lack of humanity in the civilized world, confirming his suspicion that the underworld he once ruled was perhaps more honest than the one above. The hunger was a dull, constant ache that matched the cold in his bones until the night the pattern broke. The air was a razor of sleet, and even the rats had retreated. Then came the steady, amber sway of a lantern. Gloria Fly didn't look at the ground, she looked at him. She didn't see a stain, she saw a man. When she knelt, the golden light of her lantern washed away the cold blue of the bridge. She held out a steaming paper cup, the aroma of cheap, bitter coffee more intoxicating than any vintage whiskey he had ever owned. "It's too cold to be alone," she whispered. In her eyes, Eric saw a reflection of himself that wasn't a monster, and for the first time in half a year, the silent watcher felt his heart beat with the terrifying rhythm of hope. The golden light of the lantern created a fragile sanctuary against the encroaching teal darkness of the Tokyo night. It was a small, defiant circle of warmth that seemed to push back the weight of the massive concrete bridge above them. Gloria sat cross-legged on the damp pavement, her presence as steady and bright as the flame between them. She didn't chatter or fill the space with nervous noise. She simply unwrapped the kimbap with practiced, gentle hands and handed a portion to Eric as if they were old friends sharing a meal at a high-end Shinjuku bistro. Eric took the food, his calloused, dirt-stained fingers brushing against her skin. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt of humanity that made the scars on his soul ache more than the one on his face. He watched her in the amber glow, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the soft steam rising from her own cup, and the effortless grace she maintained despite the grime and the cold. For months, his mind had been a fortress of dark calculations, a loop of bloody imagery detailing exactly how he would dismantle his brother's life. Revenge had been his only fuel, a cold, black oil that kept his heart pumping. But as he bit into the rice and seaweed, tasting the simple, honest flavors Gloria had provided, the bitterness of his vendetta felt strangely heavy. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the shadows to see who was coming for him. He was looking at the light to see who was staying. Gloria began to talk about her day, the trivial frustrations of her job, and the scent of the evening air. It was a mundane, beautiful life. He realized then that the monster didn't want to hunt tonight. Looking at her through the flickering lantern light, Eric Lawrence understood a terrifying new truth. He no longer wanted to return to Seoul just to kill a king. He wanted to survive so he could see her bring that lantern through the rain again tomorrow. The warm amber glow of Gloria's lantern lingered in Eric's mind like a phantom limb, but by the next evening, the cold teal shadows of Tokyo had reclaimed their bite. He sat tucked against the damp concrete, pulling a moth-eaten blanket tighter around his shoulders. The city was a machine of indifference, but tonight, there was a new vibration in the gears, a jagged, familiar frequency that made the scar on his jaw throb. It started with a black sedan that slowed to a crawl near the riverbank. Eric didn't look up. He slumped his head, allowing greasy hair to obscure his face. Through his periphery, he watched two men step out. They weren't local yakuza. Their suits were too conservative, their movements too disciplined. These were Seoul boys. His boys, or at least they used to be. "Check the overpass," one muttered in Korean. "The boss says he wouldn't leave the water." Eric felt a cold iron settle in his gut. Min-jun wasn't satisfied with the coup. He wanted the head to ensure the crown never fit anyone else. For the next 3 hours, Eric became a ghost. He moved from the bridge to the neon-soaked alleyways of Shinjuku, blending into trash heaps and steam vents. Being invisible was his greatest weapon. He sat outside a hostess club, and the men stepped over his feet as if he were a pile of wet cardboard. They ignored the filth as they discussed their dawn sweep and their local safe house. Eric memorized every word, every breath. The hunter had become the prey, but the prey was a king who knew every shadow of the underworld. The neon lights reflected a predatory glint in his eyes. He had a reason to live now, and he would burn every shadow in Tokyo to keep Gloria's lantern from going out. The rain turned the Tokyo night into a shimmering cage of cold iron and neon, but inside the narrow hallway of Gloria's building, the air was stagnant with the smell of cheap tobacco. Eric moved through the shadows like a stain on the wall, a silent guardian sensing a predator in the water. Sato, the landlord, was a creature of small-time greed. He loomed over Gloria, his shadow swallowing her small frame. "The rent doubled, fly," he sneered. "Space is for people who can pay, not girls who feed rats under bridges." When Gloria stood her ground, Sato wrenched the vintage lantern from her grasp, his fingers bruising her wrist. In the darkness, Eric felt something snap, a cold, crystalline fracture of his vow. He stepped out of the shadows, moving with the lethal, fluid grace of the king he had once been. Sato didn't hear him until a hand like a vice closed around his throat, pinning him against the wall. "Drop it," Eric rasped. It was his true voice, the low, melodic thunder of a commander. Sato's eyes bulged as the lantern clattered to the floor. Looking into Eric's scarred face, the landlord didn't see a beggar, he saw the abyss. "If you ever look at her again," Eric whispered, "I will erase you from this city." He dropped Sato like refuse and watched him scramble into the rainy night. Eric picked up the lantern and handed it back to Gloria. Her hands shook as she took it, her gaze shifting between the beggar and the warrior standing in his place. The monster was fully awake, and the piece of the bridge was gone forever. The bridge felt less like a sanctuary tonight and more like a stage awaiting a tragedy. Eric sat in the heavy teal gloom, his eyes fixed on the rhythmic sway of the river, until the silence was punctured by the synchronized click of leather soles on wet pavement. From the shadows emerged three men, their presence an affront to the surrounding decay. They wore black suits that cost more than the neighborhood's combined income, and as they reached the edge of Eric's cardboard perimeter, they did not look away in disgust. Simultaneously, they dropped to their knees, their heads bowed low in the dirt. "King," the man in the center whispered, his voice trembling. It was Han, Eric's former head of security, the only captain who had escaped the purge. "We have searched every shipyard from Busan to Yokohama. The syndicate is rotting. Minjun is a butcher, not a leader. The streets are screaming for your return." Eric didn't move. He remained huddled in his grease-stained rags, a scarred beggar staring at the immaculate soldiers of his past. The golden lantern sat between them, a flickering barrier between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. "I am dead, Han," Eric said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Forget you found this ghost." "You are the only one who can stop the slaughter," Han pleaded, reaching into his jacket to produce a heavy gold signet ring, the dragon of the Lawrence Syndicate. "One word from you, and we take it all back. Please, Eric, come home." Eric looked at the ring, then at the distant, flickering light of the convenience store where Gloria would soon finish her shift. To return was to become the monster again. It was to trade shared warmth for a cold throne. "I have a light here," Eric said, his gaze softening as Gloria appeared in the distance. "And for the first time, I'm not standing in the shadows of a crown. My answer is no." Han saw the king's hand twitch toward his lantern and understood. He left the ring on the concrete and vanished into the night just as Gloria's warm greeting drifted through the cold air. The bridge felt less like a sanctuary tonight and more like a stage awaiting a tragedy. Eric sat in the heavy teal gloom, his eyes fixed on the rhythmic sway of the river, until the silence was punctured by the synchronized click of leather soles on wet pavement. From the shadows emerged three men, their presence an affront to the surrounding decay. They wore black suits that cost more than the neighborhood's combined income, and as they reached the edge of Eric's cardboard perimeter, they did not look away in disgust. Simultaneously, they dropped to their knees, their heads bowed low in the dirt. "King," the man in the center whispered, his voice trembling. It was Han, Eric's former head of security, the only captain who had escaped the purge. "We have searched every shipyard from Busan to Yokohama. The syndicate is rotting. Minjun is a butcher, not a leader. The streets are screaming for your return." Eric didn't move. He remained huddled in his grease-stained rags, a scarred beggar staring at the immaculate soldiers of his past. The golden lantern sat between them, a flickering barrier between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. "I am dead, Han," Eric said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Forget you found this ghost." "You are the only one who can stop the slaughter," Han pleaded, reaching into his jacket to produce a heavy gold signet ring, the dragon of the Lawrence Syndicate. "One word from you, and we take it all back. Please, Eric, come home." Eric looked at the ring, then at the distant, flickering light of the convenience store where Gloria would soon finish her shift. To return was to become the monster again. It was to trade shared warmth for a cold throne. "I have a light here," Eric said, his gaze softening as Gloria appeared in the distance. "And for the first time, I'm not standing in the shadows of a crown. My answer is no." Han saw the king's hand twitch toward his lantern and understood. He left the ring on the concrete and vanished into the night just as Gloria's warm greeting drifted through the cold air. The beggar died under the Dongjak Bridge, and the dragon woke in his place. Eric stood amidst the shattered glass of Gloria's lantern, his eyes no longer reflecting the cold teal of the river, but a dark, volcanic fire. He reached beneath his cardboard mat and retrieved the gold signet ring Han had left behind. As he slid it onto his finger, the air around him seemed to solidify, the weight of 1,000 commands returning to his shoulders. The transition was a silent, ritualistic shedding of skin. In a secluded safe house provided by his loyalists, Eric stripped away the grease-stained rags and the smell of the gutter. He stepped into a charcoal-gray three-piece suit that fit him like armor, the silk whispering against his skin as he holstered a tactical handgun. When he looked into the mirror, he didn't see the filthy stranger. He saw the man who had Silence's rooms. "The fleet is ready, King," Han whispered from the doorway. They hit the syndicate's Tokyo headquarters like a natural disaster. There was no shouting, only the rhythmic, muffled thuds of suppressed gunfire and the shattering of reinforced glass. Eric moved through the corridors with a lethal, surgical grace, a phantom in hand-tailored silk. He didn't hide in the shadows anymore. He owned them. Every man who stood between him and Gloria fell with a single, precise strike. He was no longer fighting for a throne or a mountain of gold. He was fighting for the woman who had shared her coffee when he had nothing. As he reached the final doors, the dragon let out a silent roar, ready to burn the world down to reclaim his light. The smoke had yet to clear from the penthouse when Eric stepped over the wreckage of his former life to find Gloria. She was huddled in the corner of a gilded office, a stark, fragile contrast to the blood-spattered marble and the men in black suits who stood like statues around the room. As Eric approached, the heavy silence of the underworld followed him. He was draped in charcoal silk, his hair slicked back, the gold dragon ring on his finger catching the cold light of the Tokyo moon. He reached out a hand, the same hand that had caught her falling lantern, but Gloria flinched. The man she had fed under the bridge was a ghost. The man standing before her was a god of war. "Gloria," he said, his voice the low, melodic thunder of a king. "It's over. You will never have to worry about rent or Sato or the cold ever again. I am Eric Lawrence. My empire is yours. I can give you the world." Gloria looked at the expensive suit, the tactical teams bowing their heads in his presence, and the terrifying power radiating from his silhouette. She didn't look at the crown he was offering. She looked at his eyes, searching for the Jay who had listened to her stories about lilies and broken vases. Tears blurred her vision as she shook her head. "I don't want the world, Eric," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "I don't want a king. I just want the man who needed a cup of coffee at 2 in the morning. I want the artist who saw me when I was invisible." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, scorched brass handle of the shattered lantern. She placed it in his hand, a heavy piece of debris that outweighed his billion-dollar throne. In that moment, Eric realized that while he had regained his kingdom, he had nearly lost his soul. He looked at the handle, then at her, and slowly the king began to unbutton his coat. He knelt on the marble, not as a ruler, but as the man from the bridge, finally understanding that the only crown worth wearing was the one she had given him in the rain.